Well, firstly, good evening. It's 11 p.m. in Australia, as you both know. So I just wanted to say, firstly, thank you to Undercurrent and the European Union National Institute for Culture in New York for inviting me to participate as a guest critic consultant to Unmute Mute. And, you know, it's a wonderful initiative that was created after COVID forced the closure of many artist residencies, travel, studio visits and exhibitions, and physical networking. So actually creating an online residency, I think, is so important to keep that, you know, mind gymnastics still going, exactly what we were talking about. So it's a fantastic collaboration, and I'm really, really excited to be a part of it. And it's been a pleasure to engage with both of your practice and to learn about your exchanges and collaboration over the series of 6 weeks. So what I thought for our audience watching, it would be great to just briefly introduce both of your practices, and then we can take it from there. So welcome, both of you. So after our initial preliminary discussion, I was, you know, trying to find a really strong lineage between the two, and we'll get to your collaboration that you've been working on throughout the progression of the online residency. But what I really felt is that through distinct modalities and vocabularies, you both examine the creation and origins of perception and the limitations of our conditioned reality, which is something that is very, very of interest to me, obviously with a background in phenomenology of perception. And you both really look at how reality is conditioned, either through the representation of research, the representation of historical memory in relation to your work, Lan Thao, and Sanne, obviously in what you're dealing with, particularly with the island of the colorblind, and how we look at genetic disorders as actually framing perception itself. So I thought to start off with, we could look at this ideology of condition and conditioning, and if you could explain to us a little bit more about your incredible project and research, The Island of the Colorblind, and how this idea of the origin of perception comes into play with that.
Okay, thank you, Melissa, for this introduction. Yeah, I think all of the projects that I've been doing, they look at the same themes from a different angle. And for the Island of the Colorblind, I really saw it as an opportunity to invite people, color seeing people, to reframe reality and the conditioned notion of color vision through the spectrum of this island in the Pacific Ocean called Pingelap and Pohnpei, the bigger island, where there's an extraordinary high percentage of people living with achromatopsia or complete color blindness.
Yeah, I think for me, you know, what was quite extraordinarily intriguing about this is, and in particular this series, is that through this color blindness, there's this ideology that you can actually recognize, that you can actually see. And you use Arnon Grunberg, the Dutch writer's quote in one of your proposals. And it was very interesting to see we must first recognize our blindness. And I thought that, you know, that quote, that idea is obviously, you know, you look at this, the making of perception, and how do we actually form perception? How is perception actually constructed? Do we learn to perceive? And, you know, there's this element of dichotomy occurring with these questions that you're raising, and in a lot of the dissertation that you put forward to me, in terms of what, you know, what reality is truth. Is those with color blindness a reality, or those that can actually see color a truth? You know, and it's all these really lovely questions that you raise, that I think kind of starts to really ask the question about, how do we form perception? How is our constructed reality conditioned? And secondly, how is it formed?
Yeah, and what really also, what I find very puzzling about it is how a certain perception or a certain way of seeing things is kind of colonized and then kind of assumed that suffices for the general public. And if you use color blindness as a specific example, also in a practical reality, just thinking that a lot of people have a certain type of color blindness that doesn't allow you to distinguish red and green, yet all traffic lights are red and green. Simple things like that we assume that everyone should also see the world in the same way, or what is accepted, what is not accepted. And I think, yeah, color blindness could be a tool to kind of detangle those different ideas, or how we experience it on a daily basis, how certain things are normalized and then assumed that they should function in the same way for everyone. And what also keeps surprising me is that being different or having a certain condition is always assumed to be the lack of something, the absence of something, while it's actually it creates a lot of space, it creates an opportunity, it creates a lot of freedom, actually, also for people who perhaps are stuck in this normalized reality and who are unable to still step over their own preconditioned borders. Like, give yourself like, for example, that is what then happened in the painting experiment I did with color seeing people as well as not color seeing people, is to give yourself the freedom to colorize reality in a completely different way, in a non-accepted way. Let's say that let's have a purple sun, and why is that wrong, and why is that not just everyone's personal freedom, or at least, you know, stepping into someone else's reality a little bit, or tasting of it, can open up a whole new world for you too.
And you know what's so interesting is, you know, and you and I have touched on this previously about that shift in perception. And Lan Thao, you and I have, what actually activates that shift, you know, what actually can create that true shift in consciousness. And I think what you've set up is this really interesting exchange where you really are engaging with colors as a word, which you've often said, what is color? Is it purely a word? For the achromatopsic people, their color is simply a word. You know, they identify color through semiotics, through language. So it's, again, it's a whole nother process of thinking and memory. It was interesting reading a fantastic essay that describes how the colorblind actually try to assimilate into society, because they feel this desire and this need to assimilate into society. So on each of their pencils, crayons, they have red written, green written, purple written. So again, that's also another really interesting element and ideology about this desire for them to fit in, to assimilate, and to recognize that what they have could actually be something of a great heightened experience, which we'll get to a little later. But it's a very interesting type of representing reality. And I think we all need to step out and shift consciousness at times. And what artworks actually allow us to do that without really that kind of engagement of an ideology or awareness. It's really about that shift, that pull, taking one outside of itself. And I think in particular in this project, The Island of the Colorblind, you do reveal that, you know, genetic disorders in many ways actually do create a heightened sense of reality. So, you know, it's this reappropriation of genetic disorders. You use genetic disorders as a methodology to actually shift that consciousness. And interesting, Lan Thao, to come to you to address that question, I feel that in many ways, which is, you know, you both kind of use these, let's say, research in very different ways. And I feel, Lan Thao, what you do, as you and I have touched on, is really create this psychological space. And again, you both are creating this psychological dissonance. And Lan Thao, you create this psychological space through historical memory and through the recontextualization of research, whether it's historical events, whether we're looking at Vietnam War, and you know, to your most recent extraordinary project based on Freud and psychoanalysis. So I think, to go back to the original question for you, I mean, how do you really address through the process? And you can, you know, feel free to, I know I kind of really wanted you to look at tracing echoes, but, you know, in any work that you think that really looks at this idea of how do we actually create and form our perceptual reality, and how does that provide us with what you're doing in terms of this recontextualization of research, actually provide us with an understanding of our conditioned reality through, censorship and representation.
Wow. Okay. That's a number of works that I could actually think about.
Yeah.
I think that, to go very briefly to touch upon the shifting conditions and the cycle and this kind of engaging the viewer in a way in which conditioning, as you said, conditioning and conditions of the kind of the notion of the universal or the normalcy as what is perceived. Historical memories and events are themselves are not are representations, and that's where I start. What is the objects of our history? What is the object of our longing and desires? So Saxola is a term in Latin that basically says stone speaks, and that's come from actually another Viennese architect when he's designing the Viennese and in his proposal he said this beautiful, this kind of drop of a phrase, stone speaks. And in my work then, how does the stones that from Freud, that speaks to Freud and now is speaking to me? So I selected a number of sculptures, not thousands, not hundreds, but about a dozen or so to work from. And the way in which I'm recreating them is through child clay, the sculpey. So that's very much kind of like the malleable children's toy that you can play that's food safe, and to recreate them. And also I introduce a new component, a different kind of mythology, a modern day mythology that my nephews introduced me to a few years back, the Transformers. So by chance, they actually, they to be the good aunt, they insisted I should take them to see the 3D newest release, right, of the latest, greatest Transformer movie. And so that was my introduction. And this power of myth was really intriguing to me for this generation, right? And what does that mean? This formation. So in terms of historical events or information mythology, how does that actually shape us in relation to perception? In relation to understanding the world, and also behavior, as Sanne actually also brought up, right? We see certain thing and we translate it as such because the world say it is red and green, but perceptionally it might not be. So the grafting of the transformer parts to the antiquity, to like give them, imbue the both kind of morphing, the sculptural mashup, I call them, of histories and mythology. Transformers toys actually began their myth almost at the same year, 1837, when Freud is also starting his psychoanalysis practice. So kind of a cookie way, a playfulness. I think there's also this kind of similarity between Sanne and my work, is that we kind of want to open, or what I see is that this moment for us as artists to open up the avenue so that in terms of engaging with the issues or things that we care about, we find an avenue of play, so that the viewer can engage with us. I see that in the installation of the Island of the Colorblind, right? And with Saxa LeCunte, definitely for me, this moment of play that I get to have in the studio is a moment. This recent project is really kind of pushing my butt off when working with political, but also the social, but also this engagement of difficult subject, because each of the sculptures bring with them a whole bunch of other questions about power, right? Athena, the goddess of creativity, but also of war, right? And that's Freud's most favorite sculpture that he was able to smuggle with by Mary Bonate to smuggle out of Vienna before he left Vienna to come to London. So this 2-inch sculpture if that is the symbolic of goddess or figure for Freud, for all things in the world that he possessed, right? And what does that possessing mean? So then what is my job as an artist? To kind of also play with that. Eros, right? Artemis. And so these myths that we have in the world, then that is the Western kind of mythology. And then my job is to kind of looking at that myth and how that actually also would link back to kind of this the world that we live in, that is thousands, if not of hundreds of thousands of years before that comes before us.
Yeah, and you know what's so interesting within this paradigm? I mean, firstly, obviously, our perceptual faculties are made up with both myth, fiction, non-fiction. It's this one complete rubric. You know, we've got this really kind of lovely multi-layering of facets happening simultaneously. And Freud's fascination with such mythology also illustrates the complexity of our whole westernized idealization of psychoanalytic theory. Okay, so then it re-questions this paradigm and this construction that we are actually working within in terms of his theories that he basically put forward. When we even look at the unconscious and the conscious mind, that split itself. And interestingly, Freud and Emmett Husserl, and Emmett Husserl is the founder of phenomenology, were both students of Franz Brentano. So at the same time, which is not very well, you know, illustrated throughout documentation, we have this really lovely emergence of psychoanalytic theory and phenomenology side by side.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, it's kind of this, your questioning is really poignant. And even your questioning of then reconfiguring through clay, because, you know, these figurines, these mythological figurines. And, you know, I think it was Ansel Kiefer that said that history is like clay, you can mold it.
Mm-hmm.
And when you think about history in such a way that it can be molded into the present or the future, you know, does it actually belong to the past? You know, we think that history belongs to the past, but yet we use it every day in the present as new methodologies of engagement.
And abuse it.
And abuse it, that's right. So I think, you know, in terms of looking at how we actually can see how we abuse it and can actually identify how the representation of history is constructed, we know, I mean, and our era right now is such a heightened ideology of how history has been repeating and repeating and repeating and repeating. And essentially, we're so in this cycle of mimesis that we're even unsure of where we're at. You know, we can really think about someone like Jean Baudrillard and think about this idea of simulation, even though I have many questions and I'm not necessarily an advocacy of Jean Baudrillard, but this idea of simulation and this idea of this continued perpetual repetition of history, where does that stop? and going back to this shift in consciousness, how are we going to actually interrupt this repetition? And I really love this ideology that you have once mentioned to me, Lan Thao, that it's through the complication of the re-representation of history that this allows a whole new point of view and sense of orientation to occur. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, yeah. I think that the way in which I work in that most of the time that as one enter the realm of the space of research, history, events, places, people, perceptions, representation, what's there, and it always allows me to ask what's not there. Right? So in my work then, in whether it's an installation or a film or a piece of writing, in terms of this kind of contradiction or complications of this, I have to figure out how to kind of lay this bare for the viewer, reader, audience, so that they do not take what I'm presenting as fact, but in fact, they have to do the same kind of work. There's an invitation for the viewer, reader, audience to engage in the kind of work that I'm doing in that moment of engagement with my work. So whether it's in the installation where as soon as you enter it, there's a moment that I have to ask the viewer to suspend what they know for a moment, and then to kind of unravel with me, to walk with me through this moment of questioning of what is presented. So it's never, I don't try to present everything as fact, and this is a journalistic project. That's why I choose to be an artist, is to continue to engage the world with curiosity, right? To this questioning and that kind of this creative questioning and unraveling and understanding the world opens this up for me as an artist. I'm not a documentarian. I'm not an activist. I'm not on the soapbox so everybody will take my side of the story. But because I think being brought up, growing up during the Vietnam War, I'm always aware. I became very early on aware that facts are representation. By whom? One side, the North, the South, and then the US, or the French, or actually the Australians, or the Koreans. There were so many ways in which history or event of the world was happening at that moment. And my father, my grandfather, my uncles, all the men, you notice, were kind of gathering around this tiny little transistor radio to listen to the news from the world, Voice of America, CBC, BBC, to understand how the world is seeing us and how we then in the evening news are represented to ourselves, right? So there's multiple layers. And then so the job for me then is to kind of pull all of those information together, and then the viewer or I decipher this, but I don't have the answer. I never have the answer. But the lovely thing in that moment of suspension of belief right away, but to engage with the nuances of representation is when we actually, or I hope that we become better citizens.
You're both dealing with such complexity, but you're both kind of this play that you spoke about provides it an element of accessibility. Absolutely. Because what I find in a lot of political art that has a tonality of activism, the tonality of activism almost negates its objective. And that negation of an objective becomes too strong, and the viewer, engages with the concept, with the historical event, with the ideology of that particular topic, without actually immersing themselves into that question. And Sanne, you do that through the immersion of asking your participants to actually engage in this duality, to actually engage with this color blindness, black and white vision. And that actually, that immersion itself provides that suspension, provides the suspension to judgment. And if we could all start thinking a little bit more about that suspension and actually allow ourselves to have a completely different shift and actually be curious enough to want that shift. And it's a very delicate subject because we need awareness. We need activism. You know, we absolutely need that fight to occur. Mm-hmm. So it's a balance. It's a balance of what enables shifting in consciousness and what actually enables an awareness. Is it those two interplay of awareness and shifting consciousness? So, Sanne, there's something that you said to me in our preliminary discussion, and in terms of the island of the colorblind, you were placing it in this context, which very much relates to what we're discussing. And you said it's much more about the conditioned mind than the condition itself. What did you mean by that?
Well, what I mean is that what I'm trying to do in my work is really speak to the viewer, and is really to create interaction there with the person who looks at the work. Also with the people I work with, obviously, there's a really strong connection there, and there's the search for collaborative work there. But it's very much for me about the movement that comes after. How do you then connect with a viewer? How do you engage with a viewer? How do you get people to participate and engage, and then hopefully reach a level of understanding?
Yeah, I mean, you've raised some really, poignant questions about the power that we give the camera, the power that we give this staged reality. Right? What is not staged anymore? Right? This is occurring inside this zoo. What's happening outside? Everything that we undertake almost daily today is orchestrated for the camera, is orchestrated for the image. Everything we engage with today is to end up in an image. This is very interesting ideology on this staged reality. And I know, Lan Thao, you deal with this ideology of this staged reality. And how do we actually understand this staged reality, and how do we actually understand that border? You're explaining this ideology of the dwarf empire as us looking in. If you reverse it, there's no difference. And we really need to kind of reverse the camera more often than not to actually realize that our staged reality has such an impact on both sides of this demarcation. We need to really understand the complexity of who's creating that demarcation line. And I think through both of your practices, what you do is create that sense of allowing your viewer into that psychological space. And it's really a psychological space that allows that questioning to occur. And I think that is what is so poignant about both of your practices, to look at the missing parts, to look at what's so integral in shaping that perception, in shaping that framing. And how do we shift that frame? How do we shift the power of the camera? Who is actually holding the camera?
Yeah. I think that's so true for me to think about that, and especially who's representing whom, right? And who does that work? And that's definitely a power relation to have access to the camera. And who's developing the technology? I mean, you and I spoke briefly a little bit about the emotion the creation of photography and how that actually what the camera is trained to see, right? Who's making those decisions? As Anya said earlier on, how the camera actually has a filter so that it doesn't see certain light.
That's right.
And so that is so literal, political, and also metaphorical, symbolic. It's on so many levels that it does control. It has that power to control. So, I mean, I think that maybe it seemed too utopic, but that phone actually does do, the cellular phone that has the ability to take camera, so that it does kind of level the playing field quite a bit, right, for cell representation. So that's something that I really that think is valuable, that it shifts away from a certain kind of maker. And we're seeing that slowly in the kind of media, that whose is actually doing, whose work is being seen more and more, especially after George Floyd, that companies are now recognizing, production companies are recognizing whose voice needs to be seen and heard. And it's not so that it's not just one, so it's not just like Steven Spielberg is going to for now write a history about the colorblind, right? It's actually, should it be the people from that to do that work? I think that the notion of, we touch upon light before, and I go back to it, is that this moment of eureka was all, but without this window right here, you won't be able to see me so much, so that I have to turn on the interior light, right? This kind of power that is beyond us is really remarkable. And for me, that is a moment of speculation, right? The world is bigger than all of us, but it's not a universality. So there's two things that's very different from me. So in terms of like this notion of what otherness is and difference brings for me, that how I want to kind of make it visible, or for the viewer, is how I situate the work, right? So in my most recent film, 3 Missing Letters, is that we seize upon a moment of history that a rocket mail that was set off in India, right? The rocket pioneer, Stephen Smith, in 1934, he shot up, he was trying to invent rocket mail delivery. And so 100 and something, 43 pieces of mail were shot up, and then it blew up, of course, as an experiment. But they collected, they found 140. So there were 3 missing letters. So basically, that's our moment of entry, right? That becomes this moment of speculation, a performative place, but also allow us, my collaborator and I, this moment of insertion to speculate on history and power. And at the same time, also literally outing ourselves as maker and complicating ourselves as maker, is that we are foreign national in relation, we are foreigner in relation to the history, into the relation of this region, right? So who was it that we're strangers to ourselves, right? Is it Christeva? I'm blanking out on my names on a Sunday morning here, but I think that is something that we all continue to struggle with, and I think this struggle is actually one thing that is something that the viewer can also hold, right? That I hope for the viewer to actually also enter this place of complication, of there's not just oneness of unified self, right? But we're multiple beings and complexities. And that's the complexity that I hope that the viewer will always be able to be triggered somehow in my work.
It has such a poignant sensibility that you kind of, you know, you are creating that voyeurism within that. And it has these moments of humor, this playfulness, you know, that you were talking about. It's exactly what Sanne's picking up on, because I kept thinking of the rocket, you know, and that kind of insatiable desire to communicate, yeah, because that's what the underlying ideology is. This, how do we even communicate, you know, this idea that these 3 missing letters, you know, and Smith wanted to create this rocket to send letters, you know, and how did that work comparatively to how instantaneous our methodology of communication is today? And that comparison was just this kind of this desire to communicate, you know, and that's a very interesting point of contention, because this idea of otherness, on the contrary, is such a desire to communicate with this other. You know, as we all know, and particularly in my opinion, it's fear. It's only ever been driven by fear. Most things are driven by fear, in order to create that demarcation line. But I wanted to kind of touch on something you were talking about in terms of light. And, you know, you both...
But I want to go back to fear.
You want
Wait. I want to, I'm sorry, they can kick this out. Or they can cut this off, but I would love to hear what your contention about our desire to communicate is based on fear, Melissa.
So I think there's such a desire in all of us to actually connect. Okay, there's this underlying. It's a human ontology, but it's also our, you know, it's within us, this need to kind of connect on a myriad of levels. And in terms of the otherness and in terms of the power structure, and going back to who's holding the camera, and we look at throughout history, and it's really those that pose as a threat, you have greater fear towards. So those that you pose as a greater threat, you tend to kind of not want to connect to, because you don't understand it. It goes back to this notion of complexity of understanding and perceptual ideology, interestingly. Your perceptual framework is not built and created to understand something that you can't recognize. You know, I always say that perception is recognizing recognition. Okay. And that is at its core, the foundational makeup and the foundational origins of perception is recognizing recognition. Going back to that labyrinth of knowledge that I was talking to you about, where it's constantly contained within this labyrinth of knowledge. And we're constantly walking through this labyrinth of knowledge, which is our perceptual framework. So anything outside the perceptual labyrinth of knowledge creates fear, creates disruption, creates an unknowingness. Therefore, that fear is what actually creates the demarcation.
Nice.
Because we don't understand it.
Yeah.
You know, we can't recognize it. So what I've been really trying to do as a researcher and philosopher myself, and interestingly, that's why I wanted to raise these questions with both of you, because you really are shifting that consciousness. You really are saying, let's actually develop a new strategy and a new channel and a new mechanism that allows us to step outside that labyrinth of knowledge and allows us to step outside of that repetition.
Yeah.
Because if we can't actually move beyond that labyrinth, fear is going to be the driving force of the demarcation.
Sure, and it is right now. It is right now, right?
It is right now.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And we see
it hadn't gone, the fear of the other has not gone away.
It has not gone away.
Yeah.
So how do we make new models of research, new models of educational institutions? How do we actually change that or reconsider that to think about new modeling, to think about how we are going to restructure this idea of fear and this idea of recognition? And it's, you know, it's been through a lot of research on phenomenology for me, and what I have reduced as through a process of reduction, I came to the conclusion that, yeah, perception is purely recognition, recognizing recognition.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the fear comes in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So in terms of, you know, creating new vehicles of methodology and new vehicles of mediums of communication, light is something that's so powerful, extraordinarily powerful, and it has the capacity to conceal and reveal information, and it has the capacity to actually shift a sense of being into another sense of being. It really has that capacity. And I know that Lan Thao, you and I have often spoke, well, in our preliminary discussion, we spoke about artists in the light and space movement that were very much predicated on using light and space to shift perceptual orientation. And you both deal with that. And you use infrared filtering systems to actually create this sense of what does this gaze look like through the otherness in terms of what you do, Sanne. So you're moving around, interestingly, from such separate disparities of vocabularies you're using, but you're coming to this really lovely rubric of shifting that perception. And that's why I you know, chose you both, because again, what you're both doing is a very distinctly different to my model of research, but you're offering a completely different understanding of it. So which brings me to this question of, I'd love to learn more about the collaboration that you're both actually dealing with for Undercurrent. And this idea of Lan Thao, I know, Sanne, you kind of developed this idea of the collaboration through Lan Thao's work, Lost in Translation, her independent work that you did, Lan Thao. And through that engagement that you had, Sanne, with Lost in Translation, you asked Lan Thao to think about entering your physical space during this time of COVID. And Lan Thao, I love this idea of what you said to me, is that I love watching light and how light inserts itself into a space. This goes back to this ideology of this just desperate need for connection. So if you can tell me a little bit more about this project and where you've progressed with it. Who would like to start?
Sanya?
Well, I mean, as you brought on, Melissa, it really originated from Lan Thao's work. So it's, but it's just, I mean, it's something I could relate to and something that I found very valuable in the present or something. And since like this residency became much more a way of communicating and being in touch rather than being to do much in a physical space together or creating something, I thought this could be a step on the way to creation in a more tangible way, and still reflects a lot on that we're in this two faraway places kind of trying to connect or communicate and sending each other a message somehow, which then in a different way kind of reflects on maybe Lan Thao's practice with the letters, with forms of communication, with distortion on communication, with literally writing with light, which is what photography is or translates as. And so that's how the idea kind of came about, to touch upon the subjects through that practice or through that intervention in the space.
Yeah, so and I was really taken by surprise that Sanya brought up a work that I haven't thought about for a long time. It was done in 1997 in California, where the filters, the white light the sunlight is so strong that one would have to actually apply certain kind of special window film to protect our interiors from the light, right? Where I was moving from to go to grad school, I was coming from Ontario, Canada, where light is very important. And the winter
Precious.
light, right, is very short. Then, of course, I was able to travel later, much later in life. I was travel to other part of the world, including Banff, and there's either too much light that one cannot sleep, or too little light in Northern Europe that there is no daylight. You wake up and it's gray, and then you go to bed, it's dark. You wake up, it's dark, and it's always dark. And that's what that does to our psyche, to my psyche. So with the window film to apply, so that's a kind of intervention that that we're working on, and I'm trying to brainstorm from our conversation here and before with Sanya to how would I enter her space? It is, in a way, it is about this kind of insertion of otherness into someone else's space in a gentle way. In that, and what is really fascinating about, like, I actually am more I'm always more intrigued or excited by certain kind of things more than art sometimes. And then science is actually really interesting to me, how science sees the world, right? And how light actually, through science, utilizing light so that allow us to kind of have this kind of moment, right, with the camera. That technology, that kind of technology and the development is something that I'm always fascinated. Like, how do they think of to do this? Because my mind doesn't work that way. So I'm always much more intrigued and engaged and challenged by these creative minds, right? Trying to understand the world as the information that's given to them, and to think of the possible that's outside of that. So what you were bringing up, Melissa, about fear as a way to kind of desire to kind of push us, right? And I'm proposing also the fear of the unknown, or the engagement with the possibility of the unknown, that will actually that could also drive us to either to be good citizen, or possibly to do something productive. Let's not say good and bad, but productive and constructive, right? Rather than destructive. So in a way, my entering, like Sanya's generosity, she's setting her up to, like, whether I'm destructive or constructive this moment here. But I will always embrace an opportunity as a moment of kind of curiosity and play. And I think also it can be poetic. Like the activism or political motivations, or and as artists creating, making work, whether poetry, beauty, all these other kind of ways in which we can seduce, and seduction to engage is really important to me, because the stuff that I work with is kind of not like in the past, it's not fun, right? To think about the world, how power is structuring our lives and destroy our lives, that's not fun, right? But so how do I do that? So how do I continue to kind of survive as an artist, survive as an individual, where the world is a mess? So that's where, for my own sanity, right? So then where is that moment of seduction, So that in Lost in Translation is to really talk about otherness, about displacement, and not able to end whether or not the American dream is actually accessible for somebody like me. Queer, different, no job prospect, graduate students, debt out the wazoo. Is the American dream possible for all of us? For any of us who are different, right? And so I'm entering in a suburban home, right? But there's certain moment that I cannot enter, and there's certain rooms with off limit, right? So then, but also the entering of someone's home is only enabled by the generosity of either the occupant and my collaborator. Either is the occupant or my collaborator is at that moment the son. But of course, all of this can also be impeded when the cloud covering the sun or night time falls. So all of these are that social, atmospheric condition, physical condition, geographic condition. These are all things that I want to take a hold of. So that's so my assignment for myself with this collaboration with Sanne is like, I have no idea what her place looks like. I have no idea what time of day it's going to be. And all of this unknown is where actually, I think as an artist, I want to enter. Every time I enter this is the unknown that's actually really drives me. I don't have the answer. And Sanne will have some of the answers, but I think that as we continue to work on this and figuring this out, I think it's not, maybe it's not about always come to an answer, right? But coming to more questions.
This idea of the entering through light is really beautiful, Lan Thao, and it, entering through letters and language and kind of this structure. And this idea that you're kind of entering through this space, creating a demarcation, transporting information through light, which in itself, I believe that light is a carrier of information. And when you think of light as that has the power, light is the very thing that transmits the image. It's the very thing that reveals the image. It's the very thing that creates the veil for the image. And it's the very thing that allows us to actually connect and engage with each other on a very philosophical level. It is the only thing that allows that connectivity to occur. So I think this idea of building form and spatial architecture through light itself will create a whole new nuance. So I'm very interested to see how this project is going to unfold.